For almost 100 years, every textbook, every travel brochure, and every tour guide standing at the edge of a mountain in the northern Philippines told visitors the exact same story. They pointed at the green steps carved into the cliffs below them and said these were 2,000 years old, older than the pyramids of some civilizations, a wonder built by hands that had never once been touched by an outside power. Millions of people believed it. Then a small team of archaeologists climbed down into the mud beneath those terraces, and what they pulled out of the ground did not just correct a number. It exposed one of the most quietly repeated myths in Southeast Asian history, and it revealed a buried village that nobody expected to find. The place is called the Ifugao Rice Terraces, carved into the Cordillera mountain range on the island of Luzon. Locals call the most famous cluster the eighth wonder of the world, and for good reason. Entire mountainsides have been reshaped into flooded steps that climb toward the clouds, fed by an irrigation system that channels water down from rainforest springs above. Farmers still plant and harvest rice on these same walls today, using techniques passed from one generation to the next. The scale alone is difficult to process. If you stretched every wall of every terrace end to end, estimates have placed the total length at thousands of kilometers, enough to wrap partway around the planet. The number 2,000 years did not come from nowhere. It was proposed decades ago by early researchers who assumed that something this advanced, this precisely engineered, had to belong to a deep and untouched past. The idea fit a story people wanted to believe, that a remote highland community had built an agricultural marvel completely isolated from colonization, wars, trade, and outside influence, frozen in time since before the Common Era. That story became so widely repeated that it was carved into government documents, tourism campaigns, and even the language used by UNESCO when the terraces were added to the World Heritage List in 1995. But nobody had actually tested that number against solid evidence. No systematic excavation had been done to confirm when the first stones were stacked and the first paddies flooded. It was an assumption resting on admiration rather than proof. And it stayed unquestioned for a very long time, because questioning it meant questioning a point of national pride. That is exactly what made the eventual discovery so uncomfortable for some and so exciting for others. Because once someone finally went looking for physical proof in the ground, the story the terraces had been telling the world for a century started to fall apart almost immediately. The person who cracked it open was an anthropologist named Stephen Acabado, who grew up in the Philippines and later trained in the United States before returning to the mountains he had heard about his whole life. Instead of trusting the old assumptions, he did something surprisingly rare in this field. He asked the descendants themselves what they remembered from their oral histories, and their answers did not match the 2,000-year timeline at all. That mismatch sent him digging, literally, into a site. That would end up rewriting everything. The site was called Old Kiyyangan Village, a patch of land a few kilometers from the town center of Kiyyangan. Sitting quietly beneath layers of soil that nobody had seriously excavated before, Acevedo and his team began peeling back the earth in careful, gridded sections, the way archaeologists do when they are trying to preserve the exact position of everything they find. Within the first seasons of digging, it became clear this was not an empty patch of farmland. It was the footprint of an entire settlement, with post holes marking where houses once stood, hearths where families had cooked meals, and pathways worn down by generations of feet. Then came the artifacts. And this is where the story stops being about dirt and starts being about people. Buried in the layers were imported glass beads that had traveled from trade networks far beyond the mountains. Pieces of metal ornamentation that had no local source. And even a crocodile tooth, almost certainly carried up from lowland rivers as a valued object. None of this fit the picture of an isolated village untouched by the outside world. These were people who were trading, connecting, and moving goods across distances that the old narrative said should not have been possible for an untouched, ancient highland culture. Among the most striking finds were the burials of infants, tucked carefully into the layers of the settlement. Every burial in archaeology tells a story about how a community treated its most vulnerable members. And the placement and care shown here spoke to a settled, structured, ritual life, not a scattered or primitive one. Each object recovered was logged, mapped, and sent for dating, building a layer-by-layer timeline of exactly when people lived here, what they owned, and how their lives changed over time. To pin down actual dates, the team turned to radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating is a method that measures the decay of a specific carbon isotope in organic material, like charcoal, bone, or seeds, to calculate roughly how long ago that material stopped being part of a living organism. It is one of the most trusted dating tools in archaeology, and the team ran it across dozens of samples pulled from every layer of the excavation. If the terraces really were 2,000 years old, the deepest layers of settlement should have shown dates stretching back to roughly the time of the Roman Empire. They did not. Sample after sample, the dates clustered around 500 years ago, placing the origin of the settlement and the terracing that supported it right around the 16th century. That is not ancient by the standard the world had been told. It lines up almost exactly with one specific moment in Philippine history: the arrival of Spanish explorers and colonizers on the islands. The timing was too precise to ignore, and it opened a completely different explanation for why these terraces exist at all. This is where geographic mapping and spatial survey tools became essential to the story, letting researchers see the terraces not as isolated walls, but as a connected system spread across the mountainside. By combining excavation data with geographic information system mapping, the team could trace how settlement clusters, water channels, and terrace walls related to each other across the landscape. Something no single excavation pit could reveal on its own. Instead of a single ancient community expanding slowly over centuries, The data pointed to a rapid, coordinated transformation of the mountainside within a relatively short window of time. Rapid is the key word here, because building a terrace system of this scale by hand, cutting stone, packing walls, digging channels, flooding new paddies. Doing it slowly over 2,000 years, as the old story claimed, made sense as a gradual project passed down through countless generations, with no urgency behind it. Doing it in a matter of decades tells a completely different story. It suggests a community that had a very specific, very pressing reason to reshape an entire mountain range as quickly as possible. And when you place that urgency next to the arrival of Spanish forces on the lowlands of Luzon, the picture becomes hard to miss. Lowland communities across the islands were being pulled into colonial control, taxed, converted, and reorganized under a new foreign system. The highland communities of the Cordillera were among the very few in the entire archipelago who managed to avoid that fate for centuries. Acabado and his colleagues began to argue that the terraces themselves may have been part of the reason why. Steep, flooded, stacked terraces are not just farmland. They are also a landscape that is extremely difficult for outside forces to move through, supply, or control. A mountainside covered in narrow stone-walled paddies, fed by a complex irrigation network, is a natural obstacle course, one that would slow down and exhaust anyone trying to push through it without local knowledge. By transforming their environment this dramatically and this quickly, the Ifugao may have been building both a food source and a defensive barrier at the same time, securing their independence at a moment when neighboring lowland societies were losing theirs. In other words, the eighth wonder of the world may not be a monument to isolation at all. It may be a monument to resistance, engineered under pressure, by people responding directly to a threat, rather than by an ancient culture with centuries of uninterrupted peace to slowly perfect their craft. That reframing does not make the terraces less impressive. If anything, it makes them more remarkable, because it means this landscape was reshaped fast, under real stakes, by people who understood exactly what they were protecting. Naturally, a claim this significant did not go unchallenged. Some researchers and community members pushed back, pointing out that oral traditions passed down among certain Ifugao groups still describe a much older presence in the region, and that the excavated sites represent only a handful of locations out of hundreds of terrace clusters across the province. The debate is still active, and serious researchers on both sides agree that more excavation across additional villages is needed before anyone can say the 2,000-year timeline is completely closed as a possibility everywhere in the region. What almost everyone now agrees on, though, is that the old blanket claim, the one repeated in tourism pamphlets and textbooks for a century, was never actually backed by physical evidence in the first place. It was an assumption that got treated as settled fact simply because it went unchallenged for so long. The excavation at Old Kiyyangan Village did something rare in this field. It did not just add a new detail to an existing story, it forced an entirely new investigation into a story everyone thought had already been closed. Marlon Martin, an Ifugao collaborator who worked alongside the excavation team, put it in a way that cuts right to the point. The Ifugao themselves never claimed their terraces were 2,000 years old. That number came from outside researchers, and it was outside researchers who eventually had to walk it back once the ground itself gave a different answer. The mountain did not lie. The interpretation of it did, for a very long time, until someone finally dug deep enough to check. So the next time you see a photograph of those impossibly green steps cut into the Cordillera Mountains, know that what you are looking at is not simply an old farm carved by people with nothing else to do across 2,000 quiet years. It is very likely the physical record of a fast, deliberate, high-stakes response to one of the biggest turning points in Philippine history, built by a community racing to protect everything they had before an outside power could take it from them. Sometimes the most extraordinary history is not the one that sat still for millennia. It is the one that moved fast enough at exactly the right moment to still be standing today.